Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Shangri-La, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all about this research into decision-making processes in urban environmental restoration with this case study of the Capitol Lake-Deschutes Estuary. So I originally came to this research question because I'd learned about the decision to restore the Deschutes Estuary by Department of Enterprise Services in 2022. And I learned a little bit about the background, which was that there had been decades of conflict surrounding this issue. And that really made me very curious about how this decision could even be made after decades of conflict. So I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper and came to this research question, which is how do these environmental policy, environmental degradation, and social factors interact to shape environmental decision-making in urban spaces? So I'll walk you through just a little bit of background on urban environmental decision-making, the Capitol Lake-Deschutes Estuary system, my methods, findings, or some findings, some key takeaways, and possibly some time for recommendations at the end. So urban natural resources are really critical for building resilience in cities and urban spaces. These ecosystem services that can be provided by blue and green spaces within the urban systems are really tend to be really heavily impacted by development. And so the ecosystem services that they can provide then are diminished, and especially in the case of streams and blue spaces, these can turn into threats to human health and the environment as well. And so the decision making surrounding the use of these natural resources in these urban spaces tends to be highly complex, contentious, and really drawn out, commonly spanning multiple decades, as is the case with the Capitol Lake-Deschutes Estuary. And the community and social issues tend to be really pronounced in these systems. And so it seems imperative then, in the face of climate change and growing development pressures, that we develop ways to ameliorate and expedite these decision-making processes because they cannot continue to take decades. So that's why I wanted to focus on the Capitol Lake-Deschutes Estuary system. So Capitol Lake itself is a 260-acre water body, which was formed by the damming of the Deschutes River Estuary in 1951 and has experienced chronic water quality issues since then. Today, it exhibits low dissolved oxygen, boasts over a dozen invasive species, and is plagued by sediment management problems, I'll say. This is also embedded in a really complex jurisdictional landscape, which is to say that it sits at the steps of our state capitol campus. And that means that it's managed by the Department of Enterprise Services, who actually lease the land from Department of Natural Resources, and then Department of Ecology have their hands in it, Fish and Wildlife. It's in the city of Olympia. I could go on with that. I mean, it's also within the usual and accustomed territory of the Squaxin Island tribe. So clearly a very complex system. And that makes it a great case study to try to understand these urban systems. Now, the management issue that's been at hand here is really how do we manage this water body into the long term? What's going to be the best strategy or solution for that? And this process unfolded across 26 years for the purposes of this study, although there was a lot that led up to that. The way that this water management issue has been dominantly framed across these 26 years is essentially as a lake versus estuary. Do we want to maintain it as a lake in perpetuity or restore it to the Deschutes Estuary once more? So to answer my research question, I utilized an explanatory case study approach with interviews, government documents essentially, and I applied the unified modeling language of the management and transition framework, which essentially is 20 keywords that have like strict definitions that can be compared to other case studies that use those same words. These are just some examples on the screen of some of the words that are in there. I wouldn't want to make you read the whole list. Then I coded that data using those keywords with the Atlas TI software and aggregated all that information. And then I further contextualized it essentially by categorizing it into context, process, and outcome so I could look at it in a temporal landscape. I interviewed subjects that had been involved throughout the decision-making processes who represented various entities, though most of them don't represent those entities any longer. And then I also looked at six key documents which have been produced throughout the decision-making process. These documents were produced with the aim of helping to make this decision, and they also provided a lot of like high-level understanding of some of the other documents, because there have been thousands, probably 1,000 documents produced in this system. So this was really important to be able to look at these that had good summaries of other things that have been produced. Obviously, I can't present all of my results here, but this gives you a nice representation of essentially how I was organizing my data and some of the key findings that came out of it. So the action arena is the period from 1996 to 2022, which represents the time period in which there was a concerted effort to make a decision around this very specific water management issue, which, as I expressed, has been dominantly framed as lake versus estuary. And some of the context that led up to the initiation of this action arena was that the Squaxin Island tribe had been leveraging the State Environmental Policy Act process and through an EIS process that was previously used to initiate putting the estuary alternative on the table, essentially. So in 1996, that's when I'll call the start of this process, although there's all that context that led up to it. And in 1996, Action Situation 1 began. And the whole action situation there really dealt with developing more information about various alternatives. So that included estuary restoration and lake maintenance, but there's kind of a lot of in between. So there were actually 6 different alternatives that they were looking at during that time period. It was information gathering. And then also, this is pretty critical, there was a Capitol Lake Adaptive Management Plan Committee, which was formed. So there were a steering committee whose intention was to inform the Department of Enterprise Services. At that time, it was general administration, but to inform the Department of Enterprise Services about how to manage the water body. They sort of kicked the can down the road with making that long-term decision until they could gather some more information. So enter action situation 2. During action situation 2, there was a lot more work to gather that necessary information that had been identified in the first action situation. And during this period, a Deschutes Estuary feasibility study was produced, as well as an alternatives analysis. And the CLAMP steering committee provided a recommendation to the Department of Enterprise Services in 2009. The recommendation, however, lacked consensus, and therefore it failed to deliver the clear-cut, long-term solution that the Department of Enterprise Services was seeking at that time. So if anybody remembers back to 2008, there was kind of a lot going on then with our financial situation. So in 2009, to have some people recommending an estuary restoration project when we're slashing state budgets, it didn't go very well. So the director of Department of Enterprise Services shelved that recommendation essentially. And then the whole state just kind of put this issue on the back burner. In 2009, a couple of groups recognized, or a couple of groups of people recognized that there was a need to continue doing work. So that's when the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team, or DIRT, and the Capitol Lake Improvement and Protection Association, or CLIPA, formed. You can imagine which sides of the water management issue these two groups were on, but they really got to work trying to educate the community about what was going on with the lake and build community awareness around that. And so those efforts continued on into action situation 3, when there was a renewed interest in addressing this issue once more, and a formal project environmental impact statement process was taken on. And that process, through a lot of stakeholder engagement, led to the ultimate resolution, at least at the Department of Enterprise Services level, of this water management issue, wherein in late 2022, the Department of Enterprise Services selected estuary restoration as their preferred alternative. Of my interview subjects, many of them expressed doubt that this was actually, or this is actually the end of the water management issue as this is framed as lake versus estuary. It is possible that we're just in an implementation phase, but it seems like there's a chance that we might have just entered action situation 4. But back to my research question, I was looking at all of those results as they were laid out in a temporal way, and I tried to pull out these themes related to environmental degradation, environmental policies, and social factors as well. And what I found that while environmental degradation was clearly occurring throughout the period, the observed state of the water body was really declining pretty significantly. Aside from a couple of major components, this wasn't really the primary driver of this decision-making process. The two key components that I will point out are that eutrophic conditions were persistent throughout this period, and that the discovery of the outsized input of depleted dissolved oxygen to bud inlet really influenced how people understood this issue over time. And then in addition, in 2009, it was a big year, 2009. 2009, we discovered the New Zealand mud snails within the lake, and that closed to all public uses. So you can imagine that would have an impact on people's perception of what was going on at the lake at that time. But in terms of environmental policies, the environmental impact statement through the SEPA process was really an effective vehicle, I think, for driving this decision-making process. The SEPA process essentially helped to initiate or helped certain actors like the Squaxin Island tribe to initiate this process. It also helped provide a lot of really vital information through the programmatic EIS in the first action situation, and then to reach a resolution in that final action situation. As I mentioned, the Squaxin Island tribe has really been leveraging the SEPA process and many other legal mechanisms that I don't have time to get into, but that kind of that momentum that they've built has really been essential for putting this water management issue on the table and making sure that it stayed there. In addition, the Clean Water Act was the other, I would say, major player in terms of environmental policies, specifically through the TMDL, or Total Maximum Daily Load study that was being established for bud inlet throughout this process. As I alluded to in the previous slide, the discovery of essentially just how much of an impact the low dissolved oxygen was having on bud inlet really started to change people's understanding of this water management issue. And in particular, it made it so that LOT, our local wastewater treatment facility, began to see themselves as a stakeholder where they hadn't necessarily seen themselves as a stakeholder before, because they realized that the impact of low dissolved or the introduction of so much low dissolved oxygen to bud inlet was actually going to influence how much they were regulated. So it was a really critical piece of information to be coming out at that time. The social factor, I mean, that really leads into these social factors, is how people are changing their attitudes throughout this period. But initially in this action arena, social attitudes were really poorly understood, I would say. Within action situation 1 and action situation 2, it was really unclear if there would even be a benefit socially to, I would say, the general population, if we were to restore the estuary. And so that's really emphasized here in this Deschutes Estuary feasibility study, where you can see there in the bar at the bottom, they identified that the socioeconomic net benefit, general outcome, they had a really low confidence in, and a high potential for surprises, which meant they did not know how this was going to impact people. They did not know if people were on board, and that was something that really needed to be clarified in order to make a decision moving forward, to understand that there was political will to move that decision forward. This issue was supported, or the resolution of that issue was supported by those really robust community engagement efforts that were taken on by DIRT and Kleiva to an extent. Just community groups getting out there, trying to educate the public to make sure that people were aware of the issue and could make their own informed decisions. And the action situation 3 really saw the resolution of some of these questions around what the social impact would be, in particular through the participatory process of the environmental impact statement. So DES and Floyd Snyder, the consultant that they contracted for it, worked to engage many of the stakeholders and co-managers in this process to define common goals, which was different from what had been done previously in an alternatives analysis in action situation 2. In action situation 2, there was a lack of this defining of common goals, and so they were really comparing like two different alternatives to each other. And in action situation 3, bringing these stakeholders together to define common goals and evaluation criteria, they were able to compare those to those common goals rather than just to each other, and it removed a lot of the subjectivity, I think, out of the process and provided for a much more durable decision, in my opinion. So in summary, some of the key takeaways from this process, I would say, are that defining common goals and thorough stakeholder engagement have been really critical for the development of this process, as well as public outreach. And this just emphasizes that the role of the societal system within urban environmental decision-making processes are really important to pay attention to if you're trying to expedite or ameliorate these processes. In addition, persistent tribal involvement and strategic leveraging of the many environmental policies has been really a major driver. And I do think that there's a lot more room to explore that role in urban systems because I haven't seen as much of it emphasized in urban systems. I also think there's a lot of room to look further into the role of tribal and nonprofit alliances to reach restoration goals because that's something that really came out of this research, but I don't see a lot of it in the literature. I would also suggest watching out for the economic realities of the moment. So in Action Situation 2, we saw recommendations to the state that were really out of alignment with what was going on at the time. I mean, there were recommendations for a massive estuary restoration project and to create a new coordinating body to integrate it into the watershed at the same time we were cutting entire departments. And so I would recommend to decision makers or folks providing recommendations to try to have an appropriate scope for their recommendations and be strategic about the timing of when those recommendations are put forth. And that's all that I have for you at this time. Be happy to take questions.